Hello, I'm Murray Lumpkin, and today in this module, we're going to share some thoughts about regulatory management systems in low-income countries. The learning objectives for today are primarily to help you integrate into your own understanding a little bit of the evolutionary process through which regulatory practices and procedures have gone in the ways in which products now are legally marketed in low-income countries, and more importantly, to help you understand a little bit about how these practices are similar to, in many ways, and actually quite different from those in high-income countries in many other ways. As we talked about in an earlier module, when you think about the general process by which patients access products in high-income countries, it really is, as this representation shows, a very closed, very highly regulated, very proscribed system that at the end of the day really does help assure that the products that patients get when they go to a pharmacy are indeed safe, effective, quality products, and that the supply chain that has brought those products to them is actually one that is quite secure. As you've probably experienced in your own life, if you've grown up in one of the high-income countries, in order to get a prescription product, you have to have an interface with a licensed prescriber, you have to have an interface with a licensed pharmacy, and before those products ever even get to the pharmacy, they've gone through a very well-described and well-executed system of assessment by the regulator that's responsible for the oversight of the manufacturing and the marketing of products within that jurisdiction. When you go to most low-income countries, however, it's very much a very different situation when it comes to thinking about how patients in those countries actually access the products that they're trying to get. As this graph tries to represent, it is not a closed system. It's a very open system that in many countries, if it's regulated at all, it is very loosely regulated in reality. It's quite multifaceted and it's quite complex because of the many players that are involved. When you look at this particular graphic representation, the red arrows are trying to show that at one level, patients often can simply access the products by buying on the open market what they believe to be those products. Now, whether those products that they've bought are actually the products that they're represented to be is another question. And we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth as we go through this module. But I think you'll also see in this particular representation the many different players over the years that have evolved as very integral and very important players in trying to help assure that when patients do access products in low-income countries, that they are indeed getting safe, effective, quality medications. One of the issues that we run into, and I think you'll see as we go through this module, is that when we're talking about the regulatory infrastructures in many low-income countries, the numbers of staff, the qualifications of staff, and the capabilities of staff are really quite different when you compare them to the systems within high-income countries and the resources, both in terms of financial resources and human resources, that are available to the high-income country regulators. In this particular slide, you get an idea comparing the populations of some East African countries with those populations in the United Kingdom and the United States, and the size of the national regulatory authority in each of those countries that is responsible for overseeing the marketing, the assessment of medical products for that country. I think it gives you an idea of the vast difference in the human resources that are available to the national regulatory authorities in many low-income countries in comparison to what those in high-income countries are used to having access to. When we look at some of the key regulatory challenges in low-income countries, when you look at the three major components of the life cycle of a product, you find that within the world of discovery and clinical development, within the world of product assessment and registration, and within the world of product delivery and surveillance, there are some significant regulatory challenges that are faced by many of the low-income countries. When you look at discovery and clinical development, oftentimes when manufacturers go to these countries to try to conduct clinical trials, they find that there is a very confusing set of processes involving the regulatory agencies and involving the ethics committees. Things such as unclear roles as to what the regulatory agencies are responsible for and what the ethics committees are responsible for. Sometimes what are perceived to be misaligned application requirements in various countries. And as you can imagine from the numbers we just talked about, some overall lack of capacity and capabilities, and in many situations, even experience in dealing with some clinical trials, and particularly clinical trials of more complex and newer technologies. When it comes to registration, there are challenges that we will talk about in more depth here. But it has to do primarily in the world of medicines and vaccines with what has evolved into what we call a three-step process that often involves not only the national regulatory authority, but the WHO pre-qualification program, and also actions that are taken by regulatory authorities in high-income countries. And then when we look at the delivery and the pharmacovigilance part of a product's lifestyle, in many of these countries, there historically has been a very limited capacity to do pharmacovigilance, and particularly when we're looking at vaccines and some of the other products that are now being developed for use primarily in these low-income countries. This lack of a historic infrastructure and systems for pharmacovigilance is one of the issues that is particularly challenging and concerning when people are looking at developing products specifically for use in low-income countries. Because, as we'll discuss, you don't have the opportunity to look at the pharmacovigilance experience within high-income countries to help you with your further learning about the safety and toxicity issues that these products might have once they get into larger populations. And then there's also clearly the issue in many of these low-income countries with the supply chain security issue that allows an increased influx into these countries of counterfeit and substandard products, with the very critical public health problems that using such products can and does cause in many of these communities. As I mentioned, in order to get a product registered in a country, particularly a low-income country, so that it can be legally used there, there really is a process that one has to go through, or at least historically that products have gone through in order to get to that point. As those of you who were with us in some of the earlier modules learned, in the high-income countries, you simply go to that country, whether it's in Europe or in North America or elsewhere. You work with that regulator directly, you submit your marketing dossier to that regulator, and that regulator makes a decision for that country. Well, indeed, in low-income countries, that element is true. At some point, you are going to have to go to the national regulator and submit a dossier to the national regulator and get permission from the national regulator to legally use the product in their country. But over the years, as national regulators have begun to be established in countries where previously they did not have them, There are also other processes that vaccines and medicines go through before they get to the national regulator. As I've said, the sine qua non at the end of the day is that you have to get permission from the national regulator. But there are also this issue of what is called WHO pre-qualification. For those of you that don't know what the WHO pre-qualification program is, it is a program that was actually established when large purchasers, or what are called procurers of drug products, wanted to purchase products and then distribute them through national public health programs in low-income countries. Because many of these countries either did not have a national regulatory authority at that point in time, or the national regulatory authority had not been able to adequately assure the safety and efficacy of the products on their market, many of these procurers wanted to have a process through which they could be assured that the money they were spending to buy products was going to be spent on products that were manufactured by manufacturers who indeed were capable of producing safe, effective, quality products. As many of these procurers initially were United Nations agencies, these agencies asked the WHO to come up with a program that would assess products from different manufacturers as to whether these were indeed safe, effective, quality products. And then the UN procurers, groups like UNITAID or UNICEF, would only buy products from manufacturers that had been pre-qualified by the WHO. So that when the decision was made to purchase a certain product to use in a specific public health program along with the ministry in a low-income country, the procurers knew that they would select from manufacturers of those products those who could make a quality product and then those who could give them the best price point for that product so that the money that they had could be spent to help as many people as possible. So this pre-qualification program was something that was, in many of these situations, something that was necessary, but not in and of itself sufficient to get product to patients in these low-income countries. You had to have the pre-qualification in order for the procurers to buy the product from a specific manufacturer. And then that manufacturer had to make sure that its product was indeed registered in the country where it was going to be used. Now, often, many of these products, as you know, are not manufactured in the low-income countries. So the great majority of products that are being purchased and then ultimately used in the public health programs are manufactured in other countries. And often the manufacturer will go and get the first registration of the product in the country in which they're located. So you've got this situation for an individual product, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, this kind of three-step program to ultimately get the product so that it can be legally used in one of the low-income countries. And again, those three steps are the registration in the country where it's manufactured, pre-qualification by WHO, and then finally registration by the local authority in the country where the product is going to be used. Now, when we started looking at what happens and the time it takes to actually do this three-step process, as you remember when we talked about high-income countries, in Europe or in the United States, for example, if you do your clinical trials program, if you have good data that show that the benefits of the product outweigh the risks, and you can show that you can manufacture the product on a consistent manner in compliance with good manufacturing processes, once you put that marketing dossier together, in Europe or the United States, you can get authorized for sale in those areas in between 6 and 10 to 12 months. But when you look at low-income countries and you start from the same time point of having your dossier ready to be submitted to when actually products get authorized in the low-income countries by the national regulatory authority, we were finding that it can often take between 4 to 8 years for that to happen. And the obvious question is, why does it take that long? And what's going on in this period of time that would require 4 to 8 years to actually get the product registered in a low-income country when, with the same database, you could get the product registered in a high-income country in 6 to 12 months? When you go into the literature and try to find explanations for what happens during this time period, it's actually quite difficult to find any good data. Some data that you see here is data that the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation was able to put together to try to help answer this question of what's happening in this three-step process. And I think when they started looking at it, there were a great number of urban legends as to what was happening. There was a great number of finger pointing back and forth as to where the time went. But again, until these particular data became available, it was hard to actually pinpoint where people might be able to look to see if perhaps there were ways to optimize this system and to shorten, without sacrificing quality or safety or efficacy, the time frame so that the patients who need these products indeed could have access to them in a more efficient and a more timely manner. In this particular slide, there are 4 red boxes that I just want to highlight as areas that the Gates Foundation was able to identify that might be areas that were ripe for some optimization and some partnering to try to figure out if indeed these time amounts could be shortened without sacrificing quality, safety, or efficacy. The first 2 boxes, and when you look at this chart, it really is looking at the 3 steps that we've been talking about. The first column, which says first regulatory authority approval time, is talking about how long it generally would take for the first regulatory authority, generally either a high-income country or the country of manufacture, to get a product authorized. And you can see it's been divided into medicines and into vaccines, and then if the first authority happened to be what is called a stringent regulatory authority by WHO, which is talking basically about those countries that are either in the ICH programs, such as the United States, the European Union, Japan, and those that are associated with the ICH program, such as Canada, Switzerland. Those countries, if it happens to be approved there first, you see the 10 months that we were just talking about for medicines. Then if the first country of authorization is not one of those stringent authorities, but is another country of manufacture, that indeed is shown here by the NRA, or the National Regulatory Authority row. When you look at the second column there, the pre-qualification approval time, you see the median time that the foundation found for the products and the time frame that they looked at, that it took products to get pre-qualified by the WHO process. These data, again, come from a time frame of about 2012, early 2013, and covered 2 to 3 years prior to that period of time. And then when you look in the last column, you see the amount of time that it would routinely take for the national regulatory authority in the low-income country to authorize the product after it had gone through the first 2 steps. Now, the interesting one that to me was found when this research was done is actually in that third column, and it's what is called the spread. And we're going to talk about that for a couple of minutes because I think that's one of the really important concepts to take away from this as to why it takes as long as it has historically in order to get these products authorized in low-income countries. But before we do that, remember, as we go into this discussion further, the basic message from the last column, which is that even if something had gone through a stringent regulatory authority and had been pre-qualified by WHO, it would still, at a median, take around a year or a little over a year before the national regulatory authority would authorize it in the local country. And when you look at medicines that came from non-SRA countries of first approval, it would take PQ often over 2.5 years to pre-qualify those products. And also remember this discrepancy between the fact that if a vaccine came out of a stringent regulatory authority, it would take about 16 months, which was the same amount of time if it had originally been approved by a non-stringent regulatory authority. But yet when you looked at medicines, the medicines that were approved by stringent regulatory authorities went through rather rapidly the pre-qualification process, whereas again, those that came from a non-stringent regulatory authority took a much longer period of time. So it was these 4 boxes that were thought to be areas that perhaps the larger community could work together over the next several years to see if we could figure out better what was going on to cause this, and if there were ways to optimize this system so that the time frames here could be shortened. As I mentioned, this idea of the spread was something that was new to many who were looking at this original work. And what this refers to is the situation where once a product is pre-qualified by WHO, obviously the company then has to decide which countries it then wants to market the product in. And for a host of reasons, they then have to put together the dossier for all of those countries. And many of those countries obviously speak different languages, they have different requirements, they have different formats, and unfortunately the reality is in many of these low-income countries at this point in time, there is no real financial incentive for these companies to pursue marketing there. So what the message that came from the companies was that we will put this one together when we have the resources to do it. And then when we have the resources and time, we can put the dossier together for the next country, and then the next country, and then the next country. And as you see here, this is an example of an actual product, and looking at the data of what happened to that product once it got authorized, as you can see here in the first 2 rows, by Stringent Authority A and Stringent Authority B very, very quickly. Then you can see the time frame was almost about 4.5 years from the time they were able to put the dossier into the first of the countries in the low-income world that they were interested in marketing, and the very last country in the low-income world that they were interested in marketing. And so this spread of simply putting the dossiers together and submitting them is what that third column in the previous slide was referring to when we talked about the median spread time between pre-qualification and actually submitting the product, much less than having the National Regulatory Authority take the time that it takes in order to do its assessment of the dossier and ultimate authorization of the product. So I think you can begin to see when people began looking at what was going on in this 3-step process, why it really might take 4 to 8 years for these products once the clinical trials are completed and the dossier is assembled to when it actually gets authorized in the low-income countries. Well, there are, as I mentioned, based on these kinds of data, certain efforts that are underway in the larger community, the regulatory community, the manufacturing community, the international organization community, many of these led by WHO in its role as really the premier public health organization in the world, and its particular role that it has played in not only helping to assess the quality of products that are going to be purchased by the procurers, but also what has actually happened in reality is that many countries have chosen to rely upon what WHO has decided and a lot of the WHO processes to help them not only build up their own systems, but to help them in their decision making as to which products are going to be allowed to be legally marketed in their countries or not. And some of the efforts that are underway that I wanted to share with you today involve what is called regionalization, one that's called reliance, and one that's called prioritization. And I think as you hear about these, my hope is that over the next several years, for people who are interested in what is happening in the low-income countries, these are efforts that you will continue to hear more and more about because of this effort in the larger community to try to bring this historic kind of three-step process into something that is much more optimized, something that is much more seamless, and something that is much more efficient without sacrificing quality, safety, or efficacy. One of the regionalization initiatives that has taken off in the last 3 or 4 years is called the African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative. Now, this is an initiative that was born in the African Union and has been really led by an arm of the African Union, which is responsible for a lot of the policy and advocacy issues that the African Union undertakes for its member states. The basic idea behind this is that as opposed to the current situation where there are 55 or so regulatory authorities within Africa, that people said, why don't we do very much like what Europe did? And based on a regional economic community approach, look at the possibility of doing a regional approach to the regulation of products as opposed to an individual national approach for the regulation of each and every product. As many of you remember, when we talked about the formation of the centralized process in the European Union, this clearly came out of the European economic community and the economic organization that they put together back after the Second World War to actually begin to allow the free movement of goods across borders in Europe. Well, the same thing has happened in Africa, where there are a group of regional economic communities that have been established many years ago that are treaty-bound organizations that, like their counterparts in Europe, are based primarily on this concept of the free movement of goods. And so the decision was made, why don't, in the short and medium term, we use these institutions and these treaty organizations that already exist to see if we might begin to look at a regional approach to regulation, with the idea that maybe sometime in the future, as these systems are indeed developed and become much more sophisticated, one could even imagine that there will one day be an African medicines agency, very much like we have a European medicines agency in Europe. Now, going back to 2009, for this African Medicines Regulatory Harmonization Initiative, this was formalized in 2009, at which time a call went out to the economic communities in Africa that said, if you're able to put together a plan for a regional approach to pharmaceutical regulation within your regional economic community. And this plan is vetted by WHO and others and is found to be a plan that indeed has the potential to succeed, then there were those in the larger international community who would be willing to supply financial support to this effort. And the first community that actually did come forward with such a plan that was vetted by WHO and was found to be a plan that had a very good possibility to succeed was the East African the East African Regional Economic Community. This is a community made up of Uganda, Kenya, Tanzania, Rwanda, and Burundi. And from a regulatory perspective, it's the regulatory agencies in those 5 countries and also the regulatory agency in Zanzibar, as within the country of Tanzania, there is a regulatory agency for the mainland part of the country, and there's a regulatory agency for the islands of Zanzibar. The part of the international community that has been sponsoring this particular initiative, as I mentioned, are the WHO, NEPAD, which is an acronym for that part of the African Union that is really the advocacy and policy part of the African Union, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, DFID, which is the aid organization for the United Kingdom government, the World Bank, UNAIDS, US PEPFAR, and many others who obviously believe in this as a potential way to help bring those 4 boxes into a much more optimized state. As we've been saying, the aim of this effort is to improve a very fragmented system of product registration in Africa by focusing on regions within the continent with the proposal to try to align, streamline, harmonize the registration process in those regional economic communities and to create a platform on which to build African regulatory capacity on a region-by-region basis as opposed to a country-by-country basis. The initial focus of this particular initiative was decided that they would look at not the entirety of the life cycle of a product, but in order to try to do a piece of it and to do it well, the decision in the plan that the East African community submitted was to focus their efforts on the registration of generic drugs, which they believed was the most critical element facing them at this point in time. And so the initial effort that was undertaken by the EAC focused on the registration of generic products, looking at what the common requirements would be, what the guidelines would be, what the format would be. And what I think you'll see when we look at the very impressive outcomes that have happened thus far is that this particular regional economic community has been able to put together over 45 different guidelines that cover scientific requirements, procedural requirements, IT requirements, so that in reality, and several pilots have now happened where drug dossiers can be submitted to the central secretariat for the EAC, and there is a process now for a joint assessment by the countries within this particular group, for a joint inspection, for work sharing, for a common decision, and then each country currently then would implement that common decision in a short period of time within its own boundary. And again, if you think back to the issue of the spread and the idea of having to submit it to this country and then this country and this country and this country, each in a different format, sometimes in a different language, sometimes with different requirements, I think you can begin to see how efforts such as the AMRH are clearly set to bring that down, to optimize that time so that you don't have as much of a spread and ultimately, hopefully, no spread as far as the timing of submitting and the decision making, and then hopefully a much quicker decision as far as implementing the decision at the local level. As I said, some of the milestones are the harmonized technical requirements that not only were produced within about an 18-month period of time, these particular guidelines were also submitted to the larger international community for comment to make sure that they were aligned with WHO guidelines, that they were aligned with ICH guidelines, so that indeed they were not creating yet another process for developing drugs, but they were trying to align the systems and the requirements within this regional community in a way that they were quite consistent with what was going on in the larger global community. These guidelines, as I said, were sent out for comment. The comments came back in, they were incorporated, and actually the guidelines have now been endorsed by the ministers of health in all of these countries, and they came into effect January 1st of 2015. As I mentioned, there have subsequently, while these were being drafted, and subsequently there have been a series of pilots where various dossiers have now gone through this new system. And as you can see from this slide, they've been able to go through, and in comparing the time it took for them to go through, you can see some fairly significant reductions in the time compared to what would have been the time had they gone through the more historic country-by-country approach. Again, on this slide, you see that the numbers of products that have gone through are still quite small, but are increasing as people become more and more aware of this process, and as the countries themselves and the EAC Secretariat get more and more experience using this particular process. One of the things that, again, if you think back to that slide of where the time goes, from once the country gets the dossier, this idea that historically it's taken a median time of about a year for the country to make a decision. As you can see now, the idea in this particular situation is that the decision will be done in about 90 days after the joint decision is made. So again, another way of trying to cut down, using the current legislative and current regulatory frameworks, the time that it takes for these to happen. Another thing that's happening that I wanted to share with you is what is called the WHO Collaborative Registration Procedure. And this is a procedure that WHO has piloted and is now spreading not only from medicines but also to vaccines and to diagnostics. And this is a system whereby countries and WHO actually sign a formal agreement that if a product is pre-qualified by WHO, and then a manufacturer goes to one of the countries that is signed up to be part of this collaborative procedure, that WHO will then share its inspection reports, its scientific assessment reports directly with the country, and the country agrees that they will either approve the product or disapprove the product in 90 days. So in essence, they will rely on the work products of WHO to help inform their own decision. Now, they don't have to agree with WHO. They don't have to always approve these, but if they don't approve it, they then have to explain to WHO why they chose in their situation to make a different decision and why they thought that different decision was the best decision for the public health of their particular country. The idea here is, as you can well imagine, is to narrow the gap between when a product receives WHO pre-qualification and when it is ultimately registered in the low-income countries. At this point in time, with the collaborative registration procedure, there are 25 countries that have signed up. This is a procedure that's open to all, 193 member states of WHO. 21 of the countries that have signed up are in sub-Saharan Africa, and you can see some of the larger countries in sub-Saharan Africa that have joined this. And when you look at what happened in this very new program that was being piloted through 2014, there have been 26 completed registrations through this process that have involved a little over 200 different pre-qualified products. And instead of the year that it took on a median in the low-income countries, the median time for registration in the low-income countries following pre-qualification was a median of 59 days. As WHO looks to this, and as many of the countries that are benefiting from this scheme look to it, the idea is to have many more countries enrolled by 2017. As you can see, they've already beaten what the original hope by the end of 15 would be, that they had 17 sub-Saharan African countries, and they already have 21. The thought is, again, to get as many of the countries involved as possible to offer this much more streamlined way, using the concept of reliance in order to help, again, try to optimize the time that it takes to get these products registered in the low-income countries. There are a group of other initiatives that are underway to try to make this three-step much more of a one-step, or much more of a situation where people are relying on the work that each other does. They often can do this work together. They can share the work in ways that historically they have not in the past. One of these is called Article 58, which is an article in the European pharmaceutical legislation, which is a very special process that the European Union has for assessing products that will not be marketed in the European Union, but doing this assessment when the WHO says that the product is a product that seems to have the potential to have a large impact in low-income countries, and to meet a public health need in various parts of the world. And as the European Union begins to use this, as manufacturers begin to use this, the idea of having the scientific expertise that is in the CHMP, the expertise that exists within the pre-qualification units at WHO, and the expertise that exists within the national regulatory authorities, having this more as a joint assessment, a participatory assessment, where then there is ownership of the outcome, and these products can then be pre-qualified much more quickly and be registered in the local country more quickly. Swissmedic has also said publicly that they are interested in perhaps developing a system similar to Article 58, where they would be available to work directly with WHO and directly with regional economic communities and individual countries around the world to help expedite the assessment and registration of products. There is an effort within the United States, which was a modification to the pharmaceutical laws in the U.S., creating an incentive. And remember, we talked about incentives in the second module here. This was an incentive that Congress created to try to get more manufacturers interested in developing products for specific tropical diseases. And the way they did this was by creating a program whereby if a manufacturer did indeed develop a product for a specific tropical disease, they brought the dossier to the FDA, and the FDA authorized the product, then the manufacturer would get what is called a tropical medicine voucher, which actually was a voucher that would allow that manufacturer then on a subsequent product that would not normally get a priority review at the FDA, to have a voucher that would say to the FDA, I want you to do a priority review, even though you would only normally do a standard review. So it would help that manufacturer get a product on the market perhaps sooner in the U.S., if indeed they have the data to support an approval, than they would have otherwise had it been a standard review. Now, remember, the marketing application for the tropical medicine would probably always get a priority review because it would be something that was needed. It would be something that was going to be an addition to the armamentarium that we don't have. So the idea in this program, and one of the interesting components of it, is that the person who gets this, the manufacturer who gets this voucher, has the right to sell the voucher on the open market. And the idea being, if there are small kind of niche companies that are trying to develop these medicines for tropical diseases, really having the voucher would be of no help to them because their products are going to get a priority review in the U.S. anyway. However, if they have a voucher that they can sell to a company that is developing products that are important to them that might not get a priority review, this is something of value that they can sell, and they can then use the money to help support the efforts that they are undertaking to try to develop products to meet this need. There are other regionalization activities that are underway. For example, in the Americas, PAHO is in the process at this point in time of working with the CARICOM countries in the Caribbean to form a regionalized approach to drug registration there. ASEAN has been looking at this regional approach for many years and has been developing a system over time for much more of a regional approach to different aspects of drug registration. And even in Southern Africa, the Zazibona Initiative, which comes from the first letters of the countries involved, Zambia, Zimbabwe, Botswana, and Namibia, those 4 countries have on their own began to talk about and to develop a much more common, aligned, regional approach to registration. So in summary, when you think about what's happening in low and middle income countries, I think you see, as opposed to what we saw in high income countries, where you have a very proscribed process that involves one organizations such as the EMA or such as Health Canada or such as the US FDA in a very closed system that the products have to go through in order to be registered for use in those countries, to then in the low income countries where that infrastructure and those systems have not historically existed, where many of them are just in the process of being formed, that people are also beginning to look at other paradigms other than just national regulatory authorities, looking at these regional approaches to oversight of products. And I think what you're beginning to see, for example, with the regional community in East Africa, was with the success that they've begun to see on the generic registration, they're now beginning to say, what can we do about the other parts of the life cycle? How can we use this approach on the oversight of clinical trials? How can we use this approach to pharmacovigilance? How might we use this approach to other products, such as vaccines, or such as diagnostics or medical devices? And I think what you see is this system in the low-income countries evolving from this patchwork of various stakeholders and various approaches to how this is done, and the huge time sink that resulted from that, to an effort to try to align, to an effort to harmonize, using different paradigms that are coming forward that are based in this idea of regionalization, of reliance on work products of other trusted agencies to inform the decision you're making, to meet the reality of the resource-limited situations that they have, but yet their real desire to meet the mission that their parliaments and their people have given them to do what they can to protect public health and to make sure that the products that are available to their citizens are indeed quality products that are safe and effective.